Good afternoon, everybody. Our program today on systems innovation promises to be incredibly enlightening. Most people don't pause to consider that most of the things we rely on to complete tasks involved many interconnected pieces that are brought together in a whole because we're used to interacting with some endpoint of those connections, whether it's using a public bus to get from point A to point B, or even drinking a glass of tap water. We don't think about them, that is, until they fundamentally break down, when some aspect of those interconnected pieces no longer is fit for service or cannot handle a new element that is introduced to that connective flow. The internet is a perfect example of a system we have all become very aware of in the past year. Many people used to access the internet through work and school and libraries, coffee shops, mobile devices, homes, and it just worked. But what happened when all of that access suddenly transitioned to just the home for many? The cracks in the very system that we take for granted became obvious, and in some cases they broke. And it wasn't just because your home may need a new wire or a new router. It was because the entire chain of products and services that enable the internet to reach your home, from the devices you use to access, to the hardware that delivers the service, to the internet service providers, to even the multi-stakeholder groups that create policies around DNS, which is the very backbone of the internet. All of these things face new pressures, and a breakdown in any one or two of those pieces to that whole system that delivers the internet to your home has a knock-on effect. Many of us, I'm sure, have experienced that low bandwidth notice in the middle of a critical meeting or a child's lesson. Hopefully we won't have that today. When we talk about transformation and innovation, we tend these days to refer to a traditional business that is embracing a new way of reaching its customers, or we're referring to an innovative new product. These terms, in some sense, have lost some of their meaning and become buzzwords. But innovation in and of itself, while it can be hugely disruptive, it can also be incredibly simple, an innovation to a piece of that interconnected whole, and still have huge impact. Innovation should not be thought of simply in terms of new things, but rather different ways of approaching solutions. The systems that make up the fundamental services of our everyday lives, whether through work or public services or at home, are no different. And how we approach innovation in these systems is what we're here to talk about today. And the folks on our panel today are going to do a much, much better job of explaining it than I can. Let me introduce our first speaker, Charles Ledbeter. Charlie's been at the front of innovation movements since his report on the rise of social entrepreneur was published in 1997. He's a partner at AltNow, which runs programs for practical system innovation, and an associate at the Rockwell Foundation, which you can find on systeminnovation.org. Charlie's best-selling books include Living on Thin Air and We Think, Mass Innovation, Not Mass Production. And his TED Talks on education and open innovation have been watched by millions of people. He's a Life Fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts and a visiting professor at the Institute for Innovation and Public Policy at the University College of London. And we're really pleased to have him here with us today. Charlie?
Thank you, Stacey, for that fantastic introduction written by my mother. And I really hope that my internet doesn't break down, but I think I probably have the worst internet in London in this house, so apologies in advance if it does. And I'm very happy to be here. I mean, I'm happy to be part of this. I wish I was in Northern Ireland, in Belfast with you. I'm an infrequent visitor to Northern Ireland, but I'm very proud to be a trustee of the Paul Hamlyn Foundation, which has made a number of grants in Northern Ireland, of which we're extremely proud, including the Nerve Centre in Derry and Oh Yeah in Belfast. So I know a little bit about Belfast through my involvement with those. And I'd like to thank Stacey for that brilliant introduction, which captured so much of what I want to talk about. And I suppose what you might sort of think by, right at the beginning, I think I'll just share my screen if I can, is, well, what on earth is the connection between democracy and systems? And why should we think about that as a connection? In one sense, of course, democracy is itself a system for creating legitimate power and then holding it to account. And We have all sorts of techniques and ways of doing that, including representative democracy and elections and all the rest of it. And I'm interested in that, but I'm interested in it in the context of a larger question, which is democracy and systems, and what's the role of democracy in systems that sustain a common democratic way of life. And how is democracy embedded and deepened and enacted and lived out through those systems, as much as in some ways as we do by periodically voting. And maybe it's the design of those systems and how they operate and the principles they follow, which are important to the principles of democratic life and the nature of our communities, as much as how we vote and who we vote for. And I'm sitting in London, and this is a democratic system for me. This is the most important democratic system in London, the public transport system. And one of the great stories of London over the last 20 years has been the sustained improvement in this system. People took it seriously, they invested in it, it's raised its game, it's created new products and services, and it's absolutely vital to the idea of a city being open to all, in which all can play a part in its life, and so on and so forth. And it's systems like this, which I think this is the most important democratic system in London, which are important counterbalances to the other systems in London, some of which are deeply undemocratic because they breed inequality of power and so on and so forth. So I'm interested in how we create systems which sustain democratic communities, and the NHS might be one of those, certainly has been, the BBC is, I think. But we're also, as Stacey said, now the framework for our lives is actually fundamentally being set by systems which aren't democratic, by Facebook and Google and Amazon and Apple and social media in general. And that's one of our biggest challenges, I think, which is how do you shape systems to become more amenable to democratic life? And that is one of the things that I think will be a topic for us over the next, at least next 10 years, is how the initial promise of the internet as a civic democratic system can be recovered from the sort of divisive mayhem that much of social media is kind of creating. And so I am not a great fan of Brexit, and I am not a great fan of many of the people who have advocated Brexit. But I do think that for many people of my sort of political persuasion in the UK and elsewhere, there is an important lesson in it, which is that they at least asked a big question. And the big question was, how do you want to live? And how do you want to be governed? And they dared to ask that question, and they dared to ask it in a big way. And in a way, they threw everything up in the air. And that's what's currently happening in the UK in some awful and exciting and dreadful kind of way. So I do think this is now a time to ask big questions. And it's a time to ask big questions because we have huge challenges in terms of aging climate, inequality, technology, work, care, you name it. And I think we also have big opportunities to create, I think, new generations of systems, new generations of social systems, educational systems, energy, transport, food, you name it. And I suppose the risk, I think, is that many of the systems we're familiar with, which roughly speaking date from the mid-20th century, arrived at a time when social democratic ideas about systems, that systems should serve people equally in some sense, they are being displaced by much more divisive kind of accounts of these systems. So the systems that we create now are going to really matter. And that's why systems innovation, I think, matters to democracy. So I'll just, creating new systems then which sustain democratic communities is what I'm interested in. And there's a deep interconnection between systems and communities. If you want to change a system, you have to build a community, because changing a system involves so many people doing different things at different layers that you need a sense of movement, coalition, community. And the system needs to breed the community just as the community creates the system. So the important thing in that, I think, is in our work at Alt Now and the Rockwell Foundation, where I work with my partner in all of this, Jennie Winhall, is to focus, we think, on the possibility. There's a lot of talk about how you fix problems in current systems, how you can paper over cracks or stick a finger in the dike or get this fix or that addition. It's much better, we think, to ask what's possible and who cares. This is a quote from a great organizational development consultant and thinker in the States, Merv Weisborg. And Merv Weisborg said, after years of going into organizations and saying, what's the problem here? How do we fix it? He finally realized the question to ask was, what's possible here and who cares about it? Because if you can find out who cares about the possibility, you get a chance of creating a community that then can create new systems. So how does that happen? I'm just going to give you two models which we've developed through our work, which might give you a sense of how it happens and might help in thinking about the work that you're involved in. So we're interested in how change grows from within the environment of a current system so that it unlocks the possibility of a new system, and how you find those things which might be around now, but which are, if you like, the kernel or the bearers of some new way of living, some new way of providing for ourselves. And how do you get that kind of unlocking? So this is, for me, this is a kind of picture of potential unlocking. This is a picture of something strange happening. One of the things that we think is a sign that systems are changing is the emergence of sort of strange hybrids. And this is a strange hybrid. This is a sausage roll, but it's vegan, and it's made by Greggs, and it's on the high street. And the arrival of the vegan sausage roll for me was a marker that something really important was happening to the whole sort of discourse around and habits around veganism and vegetarian food and all the rest of it. And where that sausage roll stands in culture and industry and all the rest of it is really between a past where veganism was a deeply niche kind of activity and a future in which plant-based food will become a reality for millions and millions of people, and it will be the future of aspects of the food business. So veganism was created by this guy in the picture on the left there, Donald Watson. Donald Watson and his wife and a couple of friends created the Vegan Society in 1946. And the name came from the beginning and end of vegetarianism. And for, I don't know, 50 years, it was a completely niche, slightly weird lifestyle for a few very committed people. And then, roughly speaking, 10 years ago, a combination of things happened. There was the financial crisis, austerity. Young people didn't have the money that they might once have had. There were some really powerful documentaries released on the internet about meat production and cruelty and climate. They had big change. But one of the biggest things was the emergence of the sort of rebranding of veganism as clean eating. And it became sort of aspirational then in the hands of people like Ella Woodward and so on and so forth. And so then it moves from opposition to proposition. It moves from critique to aspiration. And then it becomes something that can shape the future. And we think that there is a really critical process in all of this where you move from challenge to opportunity. You stop trying to address the problems of the old system, you start trying to create the new system. And on the right, there is an example of what's happening. Massive investments going in to creating these new plant-based food systems. Whether those are better or how they're better, of course, then is a big question. So this is a one way of thinking about this kind of change. Comes from the work of a guy we've been heavily influenced by called Frank Giels, and Frank has studied the history of systems change in many different settings. Frank's model is to simplify it, there are 3 levels: the macro, the meso, and the micro. And the macro level is like the landscape. It's the setting in which the system operates, its values, norms, demography, international relations, property regimes, so on and so forth. The system is really in the middle, it's in the meso. This is what Frank calls the regime. And then the niche is sort of changes in behavior and need. And his story is that systems are often in this process of relative alignment between the landscape, the regime, and the niche. But something happens to disalign it, and that's a combination of 2 or 3 different factors. First of all, there might be a change in the landscape conditions. So the population starts to age, or its values start to shift as young people value climate or other aspects of their lives than consumption or something like that. The second thing is that the system itself starts to feel stresses and strains, and you can see all sorts of systems these days: financial systems, work systems, education systems, in which these stresses and strains are emerging. One sign of that is the epidemic of mental health conditions and anxiety, stress, and sadness and depression, and so on and so forth. Those are symptoms of systems which are often finding it hard to sort of sustain themselves. And then from the bottom, you find these new alternatives emerging and sort of gaining a certain traction, so they become the possibilities of an alternative system. And you see that happening, for instance, in energy systems, mobility systems, food systems, to some extent in health and care systems. And so then you move to the far side, where you have this new alignment taking place of new systems emerging in context of a changed landscape. Well, how do you place yourself in that kind of process? That's a big, long, complicated process. So here's a way of thinking about it that you might be able to get hold of. This is our very sophisticated model of how systems change takes place. It's called a washing machine. And one way to think about it is that you have to get in the washing machine. And the washing machine is this sort of vortex in the middle of this diagram. So one of the common theories of change, as Stacey referred to at the beginning, is change either comes from big organizations, say on the blue line, trying to renew themselves, or it comes from new entrepreneurial organizations trying to displace them as something new. And the story of change coming about through disruptive innovation is often the new displaces the old. We think that actually what happens is that change emerges from the washing machine in the middle, where you get this vortex of forces, often counter forces, kind of running against one another, but very powerful, which then produce a whole range of hybrids and opportunities out the other end. And we think the washing machine is absolutely critical. And so one question is how, as you can see in this food example, how you get all these different hybrids coming out, how you maximize the potential for different variants coming out of that process, rather than just having a choice between Tesla and Ford or Uber and a black cab. How do you generate from that a whole range of possibilities about what the future might mean? And so one question I was going to leave with you is, where would you put yourself on that kind of picture? Where are you working? Are you on the blue line or the yellow line? Would you like to be in the center? Would you like to be on the far side? Who do you need to collaborate? And Who holds the washing machine? Is the washing machine a crisis, a movement, a place, an institution, a process? And if you need a washing machine and you need to get together with other people and share and challenge and debate and interpret new ideas, how do you create that? So that's one model. And the second, very quickly, is to think about what the ingredients are that goes into that process, goes into the washing machine. If you like, what are the clothes? And how can small initiatives have a big influence, as Stacey said? How can you insert a critical innovation or intervention or a change of policy or a change of values, which might have an influence on a huge, great system? And so then this raises, I think, the question of whether you're interested in scaling something, which is often what social entrepreneurs think they should be doing, or whether you're spreading and shifting something. And what we're interested in is not simply scale, but shift. The question is, how can you shift systems? Not how can you scale an organization or scale a service? How can you shift a system to a different kind of logic? And unlocking systems change, we think, involves thinking about these four critical ingredients. And whatever you do, however you're working, whether you're working inside a system or outside, or whether you're working in policy, or whether you're working for a funder, or however it is, we think that if you're interested in changing a system, you come back to these four. And it's only when you recognize that will you start shifting a system. And the four are purpose. How do you reframe the challenge and reframe it as an opportunity to create something new? Power. How do you shift where decisions get made? Who has power? What's legitimate? Who has control over information, for instance? How do you change the resource flows in a system so that often in systems there are lots of resources, it's just that they're going in the wrong place? So how do you open them up, change the shape, share them, so on and so forth? And then finally, how do you create new relationships, a new sort of architecture of relationships in a system, which might mean going from more centralized to decentralized, or it might mean going from hierarchical to network or community, but it may mean going the opposite direction as well. So this woman, Karen McCluskey, who was the senior police officer in Glasgow at a time when Glasgow had a dreadful reputation for knife crime, got fed up running a system that she could run perfectly well and was completely and utterly ineffective. So she just grew fed up with basically picking up young men from the streets of Glasgow. One would be wounded, sometimes dying, and the other would have just committed the crime. And then the person who'd committed the crime would be put through the criminal justice system. And time and again, they went through the criminal justice system and nothing changed. And anyway, another young man would just come along the next week and do the same. And so she felt as if she was just going around in circles. And what Karen did was to reframe that challenge as an opportunity. And that reframing was, instead of seeing violence as an individual act of criminality, an event, a crime, what if we saw it as a disease? And if we saw it as a disease in the population, and we needed to address it at a population level rather than an individual level, and we needed to think about culture, expectations, aspirations, the whole set of institutions that people interacted with, which shaped how they behaved, how could we do things differently? And that allowed her then to take a system which had developed around crime, where there was a very clear sense of our purpose is to arrest criminals and try them, to dispense justice. That means we need the police. The police have a certain set of relationships with other services like prisons and social services and housing and so on and so forth. And power is vested in that criminal justice system. Well, how do you shift to a system where, if you say the purpose is to make Glasgow a great place to grow up, free from violence, that's a shared purpose. So, okay, so to achieve that purpose, that's not just the police's job, that's the job of all sorts of people across society in Glasgow. And particularly in reference to these young men, you need to think about education, home, culture, work, aspiration, all sorts of things. So you need relationships with schools, employers, dentists, doctors, so on and so forth. So if you need those relationships, you get access to a much, much wider range of resources with which you can then start to generate better outcomes. But of course, that means you need to think about power, because if you just vest power in the hands of the police in that endeavor, no one else is going to cooperate. So you need a new system thinking about power. So what Karen did was really open up the purpose, open up relationships, introduce new resources, and thereby bring about a new kind of power relationship in the city to allow it to dress its future in a different way. And I think that's a democratic innovation. And I think that's about a community working together to create a system which sustains a more democratic way of life. And that is, I think, is what we are going to need in more of in future. So think about these four in relation to your work and how you're thinking about those, because these will be the key, and particularly power and purpose will be the key to whether you simply scale something or add something as opposed to really shift something. I'll leave it there, Stacey.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating. I have a lot of questions, but I will hold to the end so we can introduce Lindsey Farrell, who is going to provide us with a fantastic case study on how you implement some of these things. So Lindsey graduated from Queen's University Belfast in 2002, completed an MBA in 2010 at the University of Ulster. She joined the Northern Ireland Civil Service in 2003 and is now the director of the Urban Villages Initiative and Communities in Transition Division. In September of 2016, Lindsey also took on the role as program director for the Urban Villages Initiative. Since then, her responsibilities have covered the implementation of the racial equality strategy, delivery of the Minority Ethnic Development Fund, development of a refugee integration strategy, and development of an approach to tackling contested space issues within rural areas. Lindsey's role currently includes the rollout of the Urban Villages Initiative and the Communities in Transitions program. So she is very much aware of how you try and put these various things into practice. Lindsey.
Thank you so much, Stacey. And like Charles, I too am really delighted to be part of this great event today. I do wish we were all in a room somewhere together, meeting face to face, but this is definitely the next best thing. And Charles is quite an act to follow, but so much of what he said resonates very much with my experience of the programs I've had the pleasure of being involved in within the executive office. So as Stacey has said, my name's Lindsey Farrell, and I'm the Director of Urban Villages and Communities in Transition within the Executive Office. So today I have been invited to present a case study within the context of what we've heard around the innovation systems model. So the challenge we faced at the outset was to design a programme to improve good relations outcomes and to develop truly thriving places where in communities where there's been a history of deprivation, community tension and issues relating to the legacy of the conflict. So in the short time we have today, I do want to try to give you an overview of this programme. And as I say, so much of what Charles has resonated very much with me. So I'm hoping that you will see some of that coming out in terms of a practical application through the Urban Villages Initiative. So the programme was announced by ministers back in 2014, and the idea was to target 5 specific locations across Northern Ireland, 4 in Belfast, covering north, south, east and west of the city, and 1 in Derry, Londonderry. As I've mentioned, these were focused in areas characterised by high levels of deprivation and historical and present social tensions. So there was no doubt that each of these 5 areas has its own unique set of challenges, including a whole range of cross-community and intra-community tensions, issues around a poor physical environment in terms of vacant spaces, derelict properties, and just a general sense of a low quality of physical environment. Many of them had interface issues in terms of interfaces with neighbouring communities, lack of services and facilities, and importantly, a breakdown in those relationships with other government departments and agencies, including ourselves, and high levels of deprivation. So much of what Charles was saying about reframing the challenge and seeing those as an opportunity was probably a really important part of our thinking as we were developing the programme, because very early on we did take the decision to adopt an assets-based approach and to focus on the many strengths and the many positive qualities of these fantastic communities that make up our urban villages. So identifying these strengths in terms of both the people and the programs that were already existing in these communities, and then building on those assets to work with those people doing great work in the communities to help them shape a better future for their areas. So the resources were secured, £65 million of investment across a range of programmes that we'll look at in a little bit more detail later, covering community-led projects and capital investment through grant schemes, or indeed leveraging in additional delivery through other government departments and partners in local councils. So a capital pipeline of projects was developed to deliver an additional 46.7 million of capital investment at that point up until 2021, but we now have that extended until the end of 2023. And currently 43 capital projects have been completed to date. We also focus very much in developing a strategic integrated communications and engagement plan. And again, I think this was very much with that point in mind around having a very positive approach around identifying opportunities for engagement as opposed to challenges to that. And this has very much been key to the delivery of the programme. Still very much a commitment that we hold to have an ongoing two-way conversation with communities, not just talking to them about what we want to do, but most importantly, listening to them about the issues as they see them, changing that dynamic, changing some of that source of power that Charles was talking about in terms of the flow of information and the importance and criticality of relationships to all of that, in terms of building capacity and supporting communities to have a voice in shaping and influencing investment in their areas to create the thriving places that we all want to see. So in terms of the strategic context for the programme, the Urban Villages Initiative is a headline action within the Northern Ireland Executives Together Building a United Community strategy. It's a really important strategy because it marked a real milestone in the journey of the Northern Ireland Executive as the first standalone good relations strategy that the executive had actually developed. So the programme has full executive endorsement and all of the power and influence that brings with it. It is overseen by ourselves in the executive office. It is designed to improve good relations outcomes and develop thriving places. And there's a range of commitments in terms of our programme for government in around building a shared community that it fits so neatly within. So it's covering issues around improving and promotion of shared space, building that whole sense of community confidence, building a sense of people having a pride in who they are, in their identity, but also a pride in their community and in their area as a whole. Putting good relations right at the centre of planning new service delivery models and building in social clauses to benefit those living in these areas most. So all of these are at the heart of the Urban Villages programme. And you may think some of it actually sounds very similar to other regeneration initiatives, but hopefully there are some themes that you will start to hear coming through that show how it does stand out from other interventions and how it is genuinely an attempt to try and shift systems and to do things differently. Right from day one, we recognised that that dynamic that can often exist between government and community, where community feel like the poor relation. They often feel that they certainly have the weaker hand in terms of resource flow and in terms of access to information. So right from day one, we really put community engagement and that two-way community conversation at the heart of absolutely everything that we do. So there was extensive community engagement at the outset of the design of the programme, and a strategic framework that you can see in your screen there was developed for each of the 5 areas. They were launched by the then First Minister and Deputy First Minister Arlene Foster and Martin McGuinness back in August of 2016. But it's important to say that these documents weren't developed to sit on a shelf. They're very much living documents that we use as a constant touchstone for everything that we do as we roll out the programme across the 5 areas. They do remain the foundation of the development of work themes and the delivery of actual projects that are supported across each of the areas. And they do remain that reference point for everything we're doing. So it's a living process, and these are living documents. So what was different about these and to this process to others? These frameworks drew out in a very integrated way, not just the social issues faced by people living in these communities, but also the really important issues around the physical environment within these areas. So it looked at the buildings and the infrastructure challenges, and of course, wrapped around all of that and underpinning all of that were the good relations issues. So it was very much designed with an integrated approach in mind. Previously, under many fantastic other government initiatives, these elements would have been addressed independently of each other. So for the first time, this was actually an integrated programme that tried to build good relations in communities, tried to build some of those relationships that had been broken by actually looking through the lens of regeneration and improving the physical environment, while in parallel also focusing on the important social capital within these communities. The area-based approach taken by the programme was also really significant, where programmes supported infrastructure projects and vice versa, with good relations being the thread that runs through everything. And of course, we adopt our outcomes-based accountability model in terms of focusing on the difference that we're making in communities and the impact of projects and programmes. So in practice, you can boil it down to 3 core aims: to foster positive community identities, build community capacity, and improve the physical environment. But it's not necessarily important in terms of what we're trying to do, but it's how we're trying to do it. Again, focusing back on creating opportunities and focusing on those as opposed to the challenges. So it's about coordinating and aligning effort across departments, councils, and community organisations to deliver these integrated outcomes for everyone. It's about identifying and building on what is already working, in recognition that sustainable change really requires investment in both social and physical assets, and then exploring ways of investing and trying new approaches which can stimulate private investment and economic activity. We operate in an extremely complex stakeholder landscape, as you would imagine, and this slide just gives you some sense of all of that. We engage with delivery partners in the local community through important structures around reference groups, and those are really important in terms of the power and the relationships and changing that dynamic and giving community a sense of ownership around the delivery in their area. As you can imagine, there's a high level of local and political interest in what's going on. So there's that constant need to continually manage those expectations and the communications messages through everything that we're doing. As I've mentioned a couple of times, we do have an ongoing commitment to a two-way communication with communities and a co-design approach, and really important focus on gaining community buy-in through a wide range of participatory democracy events, including our reference groups, our political briefings, and local and wider stakeholder events that are all really important in shifting that dynamic. More recently, obviously, due to the pandemic, this has all changed in terms of how we've had to work, and it has required a lot of work to ensure that that connectivity and those relationships with communities continue, albeit in a very different way. As I've already mentioned, there's 3 strands to the programme, and I'll not labour the point around these. So our community-led projects are just that. They're projects led by community organisations, people who live and work in the areas. There's been 41 of those being delivered during the current financial year that we're all in. Our capital projects are exactly as they're described. They're about improving the physical environment, and 43 of those have been complete, representing a total investment so far of over £15 million. And then our cross-cutting programmes, they're interesting because they're about enhancing and building on the community-led projects. So they're about creating connections and linkages with some of our partners across government and across other agencies in the public sector to be able to enhance and support the community-led activity. So those can range across schools programs, some training and employability support, and really important partnership building, where we're actually bringing in important partnerships like our partnership with the universities to actually add value to what communities do. So again, it's not about discounting what communities are doing, but it's about improving it and offering new opportunities for them to constantly develop their own practice. The next slide really just boils down the ethos of the programme, which is about good relations. And this vision that we put at the heart of everything that we do, which is very positive, it's very forward-looking, again, not focusing on the cross-community challenges that we as a society have faced for a long time and continue to do, but very much focusing on the types of communities that we want to create. So communities that are strengthened by their diversity, where we can celebrate and embrace our cultural expression, and where everyone has a place and can live, learn, work and socialise together, free from the prejudice, hate and intolerance. So again, very much shifting the language away from those things that are so difficult to tackle, but to focus on the opportunities and the types of communities that you can build if you really address these in a positive, forward-looking way. You may recall earlier in the presentation, I mentioned our strategic frameworks that really are the touchstone for communities in terms of everything that we're doing. Since their publication, and more recently, we have built on those by producing a set of area-based plans that seek to capture the investment in each of the areas across community-led programmes, capital and cross-cutting, and they tell a story of the government investment overall. We're certainly not there yet, but there's no doubt when we look at these plans, we've seen real change in terms of the transformation of physical spaces and in the capacity of the people in these communities to actually make a difference and to work and live better together. There's going to be a very, very short little video show now that hopefully will add to what I've said. These are the real authentic voices of people who live and work in one of our urban villages.
Project every Thursday morning here in Walkway with our on-site creche, and we work towards reducing young mums' isolation and building self-esteem. So we also aim to improve mums' employability, and then they would do OCN accreditation with us. The mums are just more engaged and part of the community. They're not as invisible as they were. I suppose they do realise that it's quite a positive thing that they both come from both sides, and their children are coming together every Thursday as well. So their children will grow up together knowing there's no difference.
There's a sense in which everything we've done, the original square, the greenway, the visitor centre, the container restaurant beside us, and Sustrans being there, those have all added, and definitely the sum has then become greater than the parts. It's a real public space, and people come from all over Belfast because it's seen as an open space, a shared space, and an accessible space.
Some of the projects that I've been working on with urban villages has been the arts and creativity
programme, and that has involved me being involved in programmes such as around Halloween, around Christmas, and St. Patrick's Day would be one of the programmes that we would take a lead on here in Short Strand. And people come in and, you know, there's no talk about where they live in East Belfast. They're here to celebrate St. Patrick's Day and they all have a good time. Some of the activities in the Arts and Creativity programme we run around our senior citizens groups. That's about getting them people out of the house, people who are socially isolated. Some of the other programs that we've been involved with has been capital programs. And here in the community centre, we got 2 outdoor classrooms. And what that did for us was it allowed us to expand our resources. It also has provided us with a computer suite.
So really just to sum this all up, I know we're conscious of time, and what we've tried to do is just to bring some of that together under the 4 keys that Charles had so helpfully set out. So in terms of purpose, I think I've covered that off in the presentation, what our challenge was, but we've really tried to reframe that into something positive, looking at the opportunities. So our purpose is good relations, creating thriving places, fostering those really positive senses of community identity, building capacity and improving the physical environment. In terms of the power, again, you will have seen a real thread running through everything that we've done in urban villages. Our ethos is very much power with, not power over. That community informed approach around empowering change and using a range of mechanisms to really raise and give a profile to that community voice, and even little things like that video that we've just shown that has come through in that. It's about engaging people in a conversation that otherwise may not have felt they had a voice to do so, and so that's a really important aspect of what we do. The resource flow, always so important. Obviously we in government have the access to the money and to the resources, but our resource provision in urban villages is not just about that funding. We've looked at the systems around that. We've focused on multi-year funding to allow for more strategic planning, to allow groups to have that longer term focus, but also the really important social and human resource that we invest in our communities through our local teams who we have embedded in each of the 5 areas. So that resource flow is really important, not just in the investment of money and resources, but in the investment of time and relationships. That brings me on to the 4th key, which really underpin everything that we do in urban villages. They're vital to the programme. Relationships, not just within communities, but between us and communities, us and government and communities, but also about creating those new relationships and catalysing those new linkages that Charles talked about in his presentation. This is a key focus. It's about us making connections and opening up corridors between communities and other government agencies and partners that may otherwise not have happened, all in a bid to create these truly thriving places that we want to see. We're certainly not there yet. There's still more work to do. There's more challenges for us to reframe. There's more relationships for us to build. But we think we have a good model here that can be applied in so many different ways, and really looking forward to having questions and to having a discussion around this. And thank you again so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Lindsey. That was great. We have a little bit of time. I have 2 quick questions to start off, and we'd like to turn it over for questions from participants. The first one, Charlie, it relates to the crossover of both the power and the resources piece when you're looking at the 4 elements. And I think we are seeing a consolidation. You mentioned this earlier in your talk. We see a consolidation, a lot of the pieces of an interconnected system into maybe undemocratic systems more and more, where you have a sole entity that is controlling many parts of a whole now versus bringing in lots of disparate pieces to it. And we're definitely seeing this as we move more and more towards privatization of more traditional government services, for example. So when you have these maybe undemocratic participants in the system, and the things that they are bringing to it they see as proprietary, How do you manage having that whole system move into a more undemocratic space? So for example, if you are a government service and you start outsourcing, you start privatizing elements of an entire system, when things within those pieces that you have outsourced break, that entity isn't necessarily going to open it up to say, how should we fix it? They just do it. And they consider it proprietary, which moves that system more and more to an undemocratic space. So how do you balance that?
That's a really good question, Stacey. I think one way of thinking about it might be if a system starts to kind of go in a direction which is at odds with important values or what have you, where does the corrective come from? And it might come at each of those three levels. So it very much matters what, for instance, the legal framework might be or the governance framework might be, and whether those systems operate within frameworks of democracy. So at the moment, what's happening to the debate about the future of democracy is absolutely critical to whether those systems, you know, kind of, in a sense, what kind of reign they have. So what happens with the Biden administration's and the European Commission's relationship to those big internet platforms, for instance, is really critical. The second is that the possibility of new coming up, constantly coming up from the bottom, I think is greater now than it was. And even in the context of that internet stuff, you can see a massive stuff happening, which is still trying to kind of revive, renew, keep alive that initial kind of promise of a lot of that stuff. So that means, what does that mean? That means you need a diversity of funding, spaces for experimentation, entrepreneurship. You also need some challenge, you know, so Greta Thunberg comes from nowhere and manages to challenge entire systems. So that's very important, and that access to new power to be able to do that's very important. And then the final thing is never write off current systems, or rather never write off the people in current systems, because my experience is there are always people in current systems who want to improve them, change them, and make them better. And one of the dangers is that you create a dynamic where you think, oh, all those people, they're dreadful, because they're just defending that system, and we're on the outside and we're the forces of, you know, light and, you know, goodness and so on and so forth. And the really important thing is to find ways to bridge that. One of the most important roles we think in this whole process is that people we call insider outsiders, and I would guess that Linsey is a kind of insider outsider. So she's inside the system but able to see it from the outside, and able to see the value of connecting with people from the outside and adopting those perspectives. And those people who can shift that perspective and open up systems to new ideas, very, very important.
That's great, thank you. That actually leads really well into the question I had for Linsey, which is really, how important is it to you, since you've gone in and you have worked on changing a mindset about how you approach these things, how important is it to get the participants in the mindset that this is not one-time change? I think we tend to like to think, oh, we're going to go in and do all of this change and then we get on with things, but it's a continuous process. So how important is it to shift that mindset as well as the actual process and practice?
Yeah, I think that's a really important one, Stacey. And I suppose there's a couple of perspectives we hear in communities. Obviously, they're always really keen to see change, you know, and to see investment and to see things happen. But I think often we don't truly, I suppose, appreciate that they actually get some of this stuff, you know, and they actually get the need for a system change and a more systemic change within their community, because often we hear from them, oh, you know, we don't want just someone to come in, invest money and then leave again. No, we actually want a legacy here. We want something sustainable. So actually that has been quite an easy argument to win. But I suppose the difficult part is to actually gain their trust and their confidence that that's what we're about. you know, and that we're not just about a one-off investment, but that this is a process that we will invest our time and our energy and our thinking to. And I think that only comes with actually investing in the relationship and really coming through on our promises and fulfilling those. So I think they get it, but we don't often give them credit for that, I think. So that's certainly been my experience through the urban villages. It's something communities want to embrace, but you do need to work on building that trust and that confidence that that's what we're about.
Thank you. If there are any questions from participants, I think we can unmute, and let's see if it won't create lots of chaos. Just ask that people, if you start talking and someone else is talking, please just hold on. Or you can pop a question in the chat as well, and we can catch it there.
Everyone's being shy.
Everyone's being shy.
I just wanted to say how good I thought Lindsey's presentation was and how interesting. And the thing that really interested me, Lindsey, was the sense in which, in a way, you were having, for it to be a success, you'd almost have to create new senses of identity, shared identity, which is invested in the future and what we care about. And that's one of the things that I think we've come across quite a bit, because quite a lot of the identities are invested in the past and in old systems. So how you shift people's identities is very important. And then the other thing is that I thought it was interesting. I mean, just that little clip about the mums, you know, what really is happening there is they become part of what's going on, they're less visible, and become contributors and generators of resources for the community. And so thinking about who can contribute, you know, who can, and where you grow resources within communities, that's part of that resource story. But you don't get that unless the funding at the top is there to provide a sense of stability and longevity. Because if it's just in, out, you know, you just don't create those relationships. Yeah, I thought it's really interesting.
Don't see any questions. I will ask one other. How do you manage the friction between scaling and shifting? And that can be small and that can be large, but if you have participants that have different end goals.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. That's a really good question. And I think that there is a real tension, because the best way to scale, you know, you start with something and you've got this innovation, this new service, so on and so forth. The best way to scale is to serve the existing customers, and the existing customers will be the existing system. And so time and again, what you see with social innovation is that it becomes part of the existing system, having set out to change it. And so the important thing is to keep hold of the underlying principles and purpose, which are different. Shift comes from having a deeper purpose. And that doesn't mean you have to scale. Actually, some of these organizations that shift systems can start terribly small, but it's the different principles that they embody that allow the shift to take place. So yeah, it is a really, and that then also raises questions about investment. Who invests in what, where? Because actually investing in an organization as opposed to investing in a field, investing in an organization is, at least you can sort of put something around it, but it's going to achieve less than investing in a field. But a field is very sort of vague, and so real dilemmas for what the best way to invest is.
We have a question from Jennie Winhall, who, Lindsey, wanted to hear a little bit more about how Urban Villages is creating that future-focused identity.
Nice, easy one for me then. It's always a tricky one in the Northern Ireland context. I suppose, again, I'm only speaking very personally from what we see across the areas that we work in. And I think what we see is often a difference in terms of how identity is viewed. But what we have seen as a common theme is those people who are strong in their own identity, those communities who feel a strong sense of attachment to their identity, what it means for them, generally find it much easier to engage with difference and with the other, and to have that more positive forward look. So that has been something interesting for us. So I think it's about getting a good balance between working with people around their own identity, and some of that may be that more backward look, whilst and investing that bit of time and putting a value on it. I think that's the important piece, that people feel that they and their identity have a value, and that's being recognized, while also then moving them towards something more forward looking. So I suppose in the case of urban villages, what has been really useful in that way has been the capital element of the programme, because there's actually a physical asset that people can start to, by its very nature, it forces people to look forward, to plan, to get involved in design conversations, what this will look like in the future. And I think that's what the capital element of the programme has helped to foster, more of a forward look, because then that almost forces communities to think, okay, if we want to be part of this, we have to get engaged in this conversation. Now, if we want to maximise the benefit of this for us, how can we ensure that those entry and exit points from a park, for example, are in the right places? And then they do naturally start to get into more of a forward space. So it's not necessarily around a new identity, but it's bringing them together around a common focus, which by its very nature is forward looking.
Yeah. And Brendan actually asked a follow-up question about trust and how urban villages gain and maintain the trust of communities. And I would assume that is a big part of it. What you just talked about is bringing everyone into that ownership of purpose.
Yes, very much so. And as I said right at the start, they didn't trust us. We were government, so we had to work at that. And I think the important piece is not to ever think that you've done it, and not to become complacent, but like any relationship, to continue to work at it and to continue to work and never take that trust for granted. That's probably the most important piece, and always follow through in the small stuff, because we'll find if you do that, communities are with you. And it doesn't mean that we still don't have the difficult conversations, but I think where we've got to with urban villages is we've developed mature relationships built on trust that can allow us to have those challenging conversations. Communities can still challenge us very much, and it's important they do that. And it's also important that we challenge back. And I think that has come from the trust that we've worked hard to build up and to maintain.
And this may relate a little bit to what I was asking earlier about what happens when you have that undemocratic coming in, but there's a question from Yvonne about what if paramilitaries who come from, live in, and are part of communities and who wield power and control over them? So how do you deal with that element that comes into play?
That needs another whole separate session.
Yeah.
The other responsibility for is the Communities in Transition Programme. So it is actually aimed at the issues around paramilitarism and coercive control within communities. So helpfully, there's some crossover. It works in 8 areas across Northern Ireland. There is some crossover between those areas and the urban village areas, which makes it easier to create the linkages then between those projects. But it's very true that in these communities, there is that presence that can often then, there's another whole system at play then that we need to shift, and that's cultural, very much so in some of these areas. So again, that's very much at an earlier stage than urban villages, but we're adopting that asset-based approach again and focusing on building from the community up around finding ways to narrow the ground for these guys within communities. So if I give you an example, they're involved in illegal money lending. So what we have done is a lot of work with communities to actually identify positive alternatives for people, so they don't have to go to these guys in the first place, you know, so that they're not being given a position within communities that they shouldn't have. So it's those type of interventions, but again, it's very much longer term work. These issues have built up over generations, and they need that longer term approach to deal with them.
Yeah. I think we have time for one last question. I know we're over. Brendan asked, how do you maintain effective partnerships in urban villages with departments, councils, etc.?
This is a hard one, because collaboration and partnership is a huge theme for us in government now, and across the executive. And it sounds really easy, but it's one of the hardest things to do and to get right. And again, because it's like what either you, Stacey or Charles, said, sometimes you have partners involved in something that have a different end goal in mind. And that's often the case as we work with some of our partners in councils, for example. They have an agenda, they have an outcome they want to get to, and we have ours, you know. So it's often about finding that where those two come together. We may have different ways of getting there, and again, that can be often a clash in culture, for example. But again, it comes with investing in those relationships and investing in maintaining those partnerships, and getting to a point where you can have the difficult conversations, but in a mature way. But there's no doubt we have not cracked that nut, you know, because often our systems clash, our processes clash. So it's about finding ways and working through that together, and trying to find the areas of commonality.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, both Charles and Lindsey, for participating. This has been really fantastic. I think I'd love if we had a few more hours to discuss. But thank you for your time, and thank you everybody for attending.